Climate Conversations programme developed against East Devon District Council's commitment to Devon's Climate Change Emergency Declaration and the Exeter University Declaration of an Environment and Climate Emergency. So the aim is that through the lens of art and culture, Climate Conversations can help us discover different perspectives and create new opportunities to help us understand and adapt to our changing planet. So I'm just going to briefly introduce the speakers, and as I said, the idea is that then they'll introduce their practice, their research, what they're passionate about, and then we're going to have a conversation which is going to be co-chaired by my colleague Catherine Causley, who is the Climate Officer for East Devon District Council. And then I hope towards the end of the hour that we'll be really thinking about what this means for us and the actions that we can take. So delighted to welcome Léonie Hampton, who has been a pleasure to work with. It's the last day of this exhibition today, which is a bit sad, it's gone very quickly. But Léonie's been so generous in the way that she has worked with us and shared her practice and shared her, all of her research. She's an exhibiting artist from the artist collective Still Moving, and is also an artist in residence at King's College London, working in collaboration with Dr. Jane Catford. Reader in Ecology, Léonie is developing a project exploring perceptions of human and plant nativeness to perceive ourselves in relation to biodiversity and the climate crisis. Lulu Urquhart, who is who is an award-winning garden designer of Urquhart Hunt, gold medal winner at RHS Chelsea Flower Show 2022, and Best in Show for a Rewilding Britain landscape, which showcased a native landscape in the process of rewilding, flourishing biodiversity, and included a beaver's dynamic habitat, which is very interesting for us in Holland because we are now home of the beavers. And Marc Cadotte, a Professor of Biological Sciences at the University of Toronto-Scarborough. Marc researches the links between biodiversity and ecosystem function, how to predict and control invasive species, and how environmental change influences the delivery of ecosystem services.
So yeah, thank you for that introduction, Ruth, and thank you all for coming today. I think it's great to have different people here to talk about these questions of climate change, biodiversity, and try to find ways in which we can be active in ways that feel meanful and inspiring to us. We're here in the context of a seed swap, and obviously this is a language of seeds, which is coming down today, as Ruth said. And I think seeds, for me, they're the original monies of the earth. They were the way in which we exchanged forms of life. So it's a really perfect metaphor for what I believe we need to look for as stories for our future, ways to promote different forms of life and flourishing for many forms of life. In terms of my practice as an artist, I'm part of Still Moving, as Ruth said, and Still Moving is committed to the idea of collaboration, that we can find our identity and our ways forwards outside of ourselves, that we manifest our ways forward outside of ourselves. So through collaboration, particularly at the minute for me with science, I find that I can step into a world of science. So with Jane, that's just begun the process of learning about her practice, and I've been lucky to meet Marc over the last 2 days as well. And it's literally like stepping into a world of which I really know nothing about. And that sense of putting myself in a place where I can learn and I can engage with my own intuition and I can discover things I don't already know is such a beautiful place to work as an artist, and I'm really grateful to that, and I'm committed to that. And I've not worked with Lulu yet, but I'm really inspired by what you've been doing these last years, so I'll pass it over to you to introduce yourself.
Oh, thank you, Léonie. It's lovely to be here. It's a great honour. Thank you, Gallery. Thank you, Léonie, for asking me. I suppose on the back of that, I feel that there's an exploration with the work that Adam and I in our practice in our studio do as a team. We really do work as a team. We really spread ourselves sideways and support each other. There's there's an inquiry that Adam and I have, an innate inquiry into how to tread on the earth and how to listen to her. And this has allowed us a great friendship of 20 years, a partnership working together. And it has enabled us to develop as individuals within our own studio practice and then put that back into the work as we go in the projects. And I think that's one of the greatest gifts I feel from my partnership and my working time. And I also have 2 seeds of my own, 2 boys who feed my relationship with the land, the earth, and my work. Some of the very deep climate change and climate science, high climate science that we've been drawing out through something called the Tree Conference, a conference we set up with Susie Martineau to basically examine the world through the tree and learn. And some of the really high science that we've been drawing out through incredible climate scientists in Japan, in Canada, and all over the world, have been about what it is that trees do when it comes to the quality of water, when it comes to food chains of the ocean. And it is I'm not a scientist either, so forgive me if I'm using the wrong terms, but it's the nutrients, the fluvial acids, minerals and ions that get deposited or released from trees and leaf litter into the waters. And when the land is able to hold those those nutrients, it activates food chains, it activates life chains. And if these sweet waters are allowed to sit longer on the land and hold on the land, the soil and the land is nourished by them and fed by them. And it goes into the water systems gently, slowly, and then it feeds all the way down to the oceans, where you'll find the plankton are rejuvenated, fed, or activated and start. So it was only probably on Tuesday of the Chelsea Flower Show in May that I stood in the garden with this different speeds of water being shown through the dams, slow and then fast water that would be where the gravels would be, the silt would be washed off the gravel and the trout and salmon would be spawning there. Those are the gravel reds, and we really managed to make a lot of ecosystem, a lot of things, a lot of habitats, a lot of. We were trying to show as much as we could in a small space of what it is that a beaver and a keystone species does in its activation of landscape, how it completely radicalizes a feeling of the entire phenomenon of land into bioflourishing. And it was there that I stood, and I remembered the science that we've been filtering through from the Tree Conference. And I saw that the beaver dam was exactly what it is that we were trying to learn through the tree. And I felt at this moment that was, for me, that was my arrival into the garden. And that was why I did, it was why it had come to us. It was just this sort of the multi-dimensional 3-day art installation of a space to show all it is that we love to investigate and learn more about, and then try and put back into our work to get it out there into the world. So.
Well, first of all, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for the invitation. More than a week ago, I didn't know I was going to do this, and now I'm in England, and here I am. This is wonderful. So my name is Marc Cadotte. I'm a professor of biological sciences. I think this is really fascinating that we have people that work in the arts and design together with scientists to reflect on and think about this space between plants and climate change, which interestingly is the space I work in. My main research is around biodiversity, especially with plants, plant-based ecosystems, but mostly understanding how human-caused changes in biodiversity manifest in changes to the functioning of ecosystems. And I came to realize about 10 years ago, nowhere is this more important than in cities, right? This is the main concentration of human activities. The human impact is most profound in cities, and this is where we can understand how our actions impact biodiversity and the functioning of ecosystems. And when we think about climate change, I think cities are really pertinent for two main reasons. The first one is that cities are, in some ways, a small view into the future, right? Cities are places that are already warmer. They have more intense weather events. So we get flooding that's more intense in cities. We have poor quality air. We have pollution. We have the concentration of all these effects we think are coming with climate change. So we can see how those impacts are impacting not only individuals, people, their health, but biodiversity, the species we find in cities, and how those changes to biodiversity are scaling up to changes in ecosystem function and the benefits that people derive from them. So we think of nature in cities as a way in which people can realize a better environmental quality. You take away biodiversity in cities, the environmental quality of cities goes down. So in some ways, climate change can give us a window into that future. So that's the one hand, and that sounds pretty negative. But there's a second side of it, which is we also see a lot of innovation in cities. We see, for example, even here in the UK, you see tree planting programs. You see people thinking about green infrastructure, redesigning the spaces we live in order to include more of the green. And so in that window into the future, not only are we seeing those negative impacts, but we can see how people respond in the face of these negative environmental qualities that they face to use things like nature, ecosystems, green infrastructure to try to improve. And so we can kind of learn from what people are already doing and thinking about how we can roll that out on larger scales in order to build up nature-based solutions to combating some of the worst impacts of climate change. And so I'm really excited to be here today to hear what people think about this space between plants and climate change, and to learn and think myself about how I might implement some of these ideas in our future science. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Jane Catford. I'm a reader in ecology at King's College London. For those of you who don't know, some universities in the UK call associate professors readers, and King's is one of those. I'm equivalent of the associate professor, so some of you might be more familiar with that term. So I'm a plant ecologist, and this is my dog, Billy. So that is why he's quite keen to come over here. So apologies, maybe Mark and I should swap seats. I grew up in Wales, moved to Australia at the age of 15, so you might hear a bit of the twang in my accent, and I've always been passionate about the environment, probably like many of us here, and my particular favourite ecosystem, it's always been plants for me, which is quite strange. At university, the domination was very much in the animal sphere. The botanists, I think there were about 12 of us to about 80 of the zoologists, so we were a unique, but quality over quantity, that's what they say, isn't it? So my passion was plants always. And particularly river system, so freshwater ecosystem. So it's a nice overlap with Lulu there, where she's talking about the beavers. And so I sort of pursued that passion and followed it into a PhD. And I was focusing really on, I was really interested in Australia, as many of you know, it's the driest inhabited continent. So water is a really precious resource for us. And because of that, to grow our food, we dam rivers. We therefore change the flow in the rivers, and all of the organisms, all of the species, the functioning of the river gets really affected by that. So you could imagine, like here, it's temperate climate where we are in Australia, or where I was in Australia, and so you have rainfall happening in winter, and so that's normally when you get the peak floods coming through. But because there's very little water, we store up that water and we release it in summer, so that you can irrigate the crops. So obviously summer is a good time to be growing all of those crops. So you're basically inverting that flow regime. And so this has lots of different consequences. And one, because I'm interested in plants, I was really interested in what was happening in the riparian zones, which is the fancy name for riverside vegetation, and in wetlands that are along the rivers. And so I really delved into that, and then that got me into invasion ecology. That's what we call it. So when we're dealing with non-native or non-indigenous invasive species. And what I found, and what has kind of led me to continue on over the last 15 years or so, is that this flipping of the environmental conditions, so moving away from natural, historical conditions, was disadvantaging our natives. So our native plants were dropping out with lots of consequences to the rest of the ecosystem and the functions and the birds and the fish. And then instead, and in their place, there were these non-native plants coming from different parts of the world. And there's so many fascinating questions with this. So some of these species that were taking over in Australia were actually really rare in their native range. And so this is kind of fascinating. And another connection I've just sort of noticed is we would call, as an ecologist, we call animals that shape ecosystems, we'll call those ecosystem engineers. So a beaver is a very obvious example. And plants, we call them transformers. And so some of the invasive species that we were seeing come in were transforming these ecosystems to suit themselves, as that has lots of different implications. But anyway, I'll wrap up because I don't want to dominate too much. But that sort of intersection with environmental change, so thinking about the water regime in that sense, the flooding regime, has now led me on to look at broader impacts of climate change, to look at broader impacts of adding nitrogen to our soils through fossil fuel use, through fertilizers, and how this is kind of flipping the natural sort of conditions that suit our native species, enables these non-native species to come in, and then they sort of propagate that further, that change further. So my research is really about trying to understand, predict, better manage environmental change in all senses of the word. And so I look at that from all sorts of different perspectives, but often through the lens of using non-native plant invasions to help us diagnose and understand that. So delighted to be here.
Yeah, Lulu, perhaps you could carry on and share a little bit about your work that you're doing with Jane.
Yeah, well, I mean, just hearing you all speak, I'm really interested in that idea of the urban environment as a place to break down the divide between the rural and the artificial divide, really, between the rural and the urban, that both these places are dependent upon our relationship with nature, and we need to connect back into it. And I was thinking of this quote by Patrick Geddes, who was an ecologist working at the beginning of the 1900s and also a town planner, and he was trained in the Royal Botanic Gardens. And I just wanted to read this because it was coming up with a few things you were all saying. He said, "How many people think twice about a leaf? Yet the leaf is the chief product and phenomenon of life. This is a green world with animals comparatively few and small, and all dependent upon leaves. By leaves we live. Some people have strange ideas that they live by money. They think energy is generated by the circulation of coins. But the world is mainly a vast leaf colony, growing on and forming a leafy soil, not a mere mineral mass. So we live not by the jingling of our coins, but by the fullness of our harvests." I thought that was really special. And the idea that we could have people working in town planning, people like Catherine, from what I understand, who really, really are trying to forefront ways in which we can bring more green spaces into our environments, into our urban environments, feels really critical to me. But Ruth, you would like me to talk more about my collaborations? And so with Jane, Jane talked about her invasive plant research, and so we're coming together, as I described at the beginning, where I'm trying to immerse myself into her practice and learn from that. And I'm particularly interested myself in how we can learn from plants, almost like the way that science fiction and speculative fiction works, where we can read about a story on a planet far away, which reflects back into our actual current human situation. Through plants, we can begin to understand ourselves potentially in that same way, because these other species, when we can see the way that they're interacting, what's happening, there's often these direct correlations between human behaviours, and often what's happening as well is that they turn mirrors back to us to show that it's really about our perception and really about the way that we're thinking about plants. And plants themselves have their own ingenious mechanisms of working in this world, ingenious ways of evolving. And if we can give them the space, and we can work with them in ways where they can get on with the work they need to do in some aspects. I think that's a really interesting learning of our part as well, that we're not the entire managers of this world. So I'm kind of I come from a very kind of poetic and metaphoric perspective, but I find the science absolutely essential in terms of facing the crises that we're in, because that's where science itself, from my experience so far of working with scientists, is changing. It's not a factual, stuck thing. It's evolving itself. And to be in the spirit of people who are very concentrated on trying to get to the roots of problems, but they themselves are like a river that is changing, is a really interesting place to interface with art, which is doing a similar thing. But we were talking earlier about perhaps one difference is that art perhaps is a little bit more like an ocean in its relationship to time, and that science is running in quite a linear way, is in its discovery, and things are changing, whereas art is working a slightly different way with time. It can pop up different aspects way from the past, ancient time. It can work from that in ways that feel useful to this moment in time. And I think science and art are both trying to find useful ways forward in terms of the kind of science and art that I'm interested in. And yeah, I mentioned earlier about that idea of collaboration. I think we are in a time of emergency, and Rebecca Solnit in her book Hope in the Dark says that the word emergency contains the word emerge. So there is an enormous possibility for new ways to emerge in this time. And I feel like we have a kind of like a little time sand thing that's going a little bit fast. So the more we can work together, the better. Like I could work trying to figure out microscopes, trying to prove myself as an artist in the scientific realm, but that's not interesting, that's not useful. I'd far rather come in and work with scientists to do that together, because I think that there's an awful lot of crossover where there is incredible creativity, incredible art going on within the realm of science, and giving that space into my practice for that to emerge as well is what I've done previously with. If you go onto the Still Moving website, you can watch Our Body as a Planet, for example. These are lots of the visual work you will see in that is filmed by scientists. So I hope that gives you what you'd like to know.
I was wondering if you could share a little bit about the new work that's upstairs that developed through this show and against the context of James' research.
Yeah, so if you go upstairs, there's what's called this sort of Still Moving archive room, and that was the very beginning of a conversation with Jane as this exhibition became clear it was happening and the residency came to fruition. And you'll see upstairs, so it's a very playful initial interaction with Jane's team's research. There are these bowls, there are 9 bowls on shelves. Each of them contains seeds from Harry, who is one of Jane's collaborators. They're seeds that he had for an experiment he's doing. They're all seeds which are, they're non-native to this country, but they're all present here. So they're plants that have arrived in England through human activity, and they're now prevalent everywhere. And so you can put your hand just inside the seeds and you can feel them. And this idea of, for me, this question of native and non-native in terms of that, what I talked about, that mirror into our own senses of where we come from and who we are, is interesting. For me, as a human, I'm of the school of thought that you become indigenous to place by caring for it. So that's an interesting reflection back into Jane's work, because these plants that may come and they may dominate and they may be thugs and they may wipe ecosystem. Well, that's not caring for a place. So that has a human mirror to it in itself, which, I hope to learn more about. But the seeds upstairs in the bowls, what I brought to them visually, you can pick out these little gold labels and read what they are, these plants, and their origin and what they're now doing. Some of them, for example, are the ones that are on golf courses all over the country. or couch grass, which many gardeners will know is a bugbearer in our gardens. But they're sitting there in these bowls, and I call it Parable of the Sowers, which comes from Octavia Butler's book, Parable of the Sower. And that is an incredible book, quite dystopic, with utopic kind of sort of visions in it as well. But this idea of what the seed, like in that book, we see a world which is crumbling, a horrible world. But these people, they have the vision of going to a place where they can put their hands in the soil and that they can plant and begin a world where they grow their own food. And so I'm bringing that line of my research into Jane's line of research. And I think that's how we will continue our work. It's sort of a form of co-creation where we're bringing our different streams of knowledge together.
Jane, perhaps you could share a bit about how Leonie's practice or working with an artist is informing your research or the way you're working.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really excited about working with Leonie. So we're very, it's sort of early days. So we wrote this proposal together. So we met at a workshop maybe 3-4 months ago where a group of an equal number of academics, researchers were brought together. Most of us focused on some form of environmental change, reflecting this climate change emergency that we're facing. And then the same number of artists, and we all sort of interacted and met, and we hit it off, probably through talking about maybe seeds, I think plant blindness we mentioned as well, and then it came out of that. I mean, I absolutely love seeds. I mean, you have to, I think, if you're a plant ecologist, you're pretty into them, but I just find them just so amazing, and I've done seed addition experiments where I've added, a bunch of different seeds, as well as doing stuff in my own garden. But I just love the diversity of them, the size differences, their strategies. They're just amazing. How they disperse is just incredible. You look at all of these incredible sort of adaptations that they've evolved over, so many generations, and it enables them to do this special thing that they're really good at this one thing, and they've got this one dispersal mechanism. And also, I love seeds because we think of them as dispersal through space, because we see them floating down a river, or we see them being blown in the wind, but they're also dispersal through time, which I really love that concept. And they deposit themselves in the soil, they go down deep, the rounder they are, the deeper they go and the longer they last. And so some seeds, we were talking last night about, dates have been found 3,000 years later to be able to still grow. So they're just amazing, and a lot of them have these incredible adaptations, that they'll only germinate after fire, or they'll time their germination so they know that they're going to be there when the floodwaters come, so that they'll be watered. So I have a particular passion for seeds, but I'm excited about working with Leonie because I think so I sort of gave an insight before about that I tend to work with, not exclusively, but I tend to work with non-native plant invasions or non-indigenous, that we use different terms, and in different countries it's quite interesting. We're in different regions of the world, we use different terms for that. And I like using those because they help us understand ecology in general. They provide us sort of this unplanned, uncontrolled experiment that we can see around the world, but also they're a major form or a major threat to biodiversity. So one of the top 5 threats, and we know that biodiversity is really threatened. So I'm also very motivated to work with them in that regard, because they help us, presumably if we understand invasions better, and we know what drives them, and we know the impacts of them, we can manage them better, and we can kind of cut them off at the pass, as it were. And the other critical thing I should say with that is that not all non-indigenous species are going to be bad. Not all of them are thugs. It's about 1% of them end up being really bad, but we need to be able to distinguish. So snowdrops, I think, I was admiring some snowdrops today because it's spring is coming. They're introduced to the UK. I think I was really shocked to know that. It was a long time ago, but they're non-native to the UK. But you compare them with something like Japanese knotweed or Himalayan balsam or rhododendron, and you can clearly see that these are non-native species that are behaving quite differently, and the impacts of them are quite different. And we probably want to manage some and stop some spreading and doing their thing, which damages ecosystems, and the others we probably don't need to worry about. because they're not doing actually much harm, and managers can use their resources more selectively. So I'm motivated to try and work out which species are in that camp and which species are in this camp, and that can be quite instructive. But when you work with non-native species, there are comparisons made with sort of human immigration and human movement around the world. And so there's a lot of discussion and a lot of debate in my field of invasion ecology about sort of the terminology that we use, and often there are debates from outside the field as well. So thinking, okay, is this xenophobia? Why are they getting so uptight about alien or non-native? How does this relate? And so we have, within our field, we have challenges and debates, and we debate with other academics about this, and really are trying to get at sort of the root of it all. But I'm quite excited to be working with someone who's coming from a really different background to sort of shine a lens on this and help me and help my team to look at these questions from a different angle and a different perspective. So I'm really excited about that in particular, among other things. But yeah.
And Mark, I was wondering if you could share the differences in approach that over in Canada to how we're looking at it through the lens in England.
That's a great question. So there are certainly geographical differences in how people approach problems, and a part of that is the context. So the context in Canada, for example, is quite different than the UK. So the footprint of sort of human impact is much greater here, is much more profound, has been much more profound for a very long time. In Canada, I would say we know what wild is, right? In the UK, the sense of wild is very different. You know, when I travel around the UK and I see on flags and banners bears and wolves and other things like that, you know, people here used to know what wild is, and now it's a human landscape. In Canada, our sense of what Indigenous is and non-Indigenous might be quite different, because most of those species that we would think of as non-Indigenous have been brought over quite recently, and many non-Indigenous species here and elsewhere in Europe, for example, might have moved with people thousands of years ago, and so that attachment to species is quite different here. The other thing is terminology, and so Jane touched on this. In Canada, we would not use the word alien to describe these species because it has negative connotations about people who are deemed to be not legally in the country. And so we tend to use the words Indigenous and non-Indigenous. We sometimes use native, non-native, but there's these differences in terminology, and we're talking about this a couple of times because I might not even see literature because I'm not using the same terms to look for papers, or we might be talking past each other in some ways. But at the end of the day, I think we all agree that on sort of the magnitude of the problem, and that's what's interesting is that you have a place like the UK where the human imprint is so strong and has been here for so long, that you still have a species coming in, say 20, 30 years ago, that still has a profound impact on the environment. And that way it's no different than in Canada, where we also have Japanese knotweed that's come in, and I can see it along train tracks, I can see it spreading. You know, cities or municipalities and management agencies are really worried about it in very much the same way as here. And that's very interesting. And so we come together in these types of collaborations and we ask, you know, what is it about some of these species that allow them to do this? Maybe sometimes there's differences. So in Canada, certain types of species might do really well. In the UK, might be different kinds of species. But sometimes there's these few species that have such a profound impact that it brings us all together despite differences in terminology, that really trying to understand what it is about them and how we can manage them.
Thank you. I think it's not really time to hand over to the floor for questions. I'm going to stand up and take a mic, and then I'm going to ask a friendly volunteer to take it around. First question is
my name is Kwai from Hong Kong. 2009, I learned organic farming and go to the organic farm to be a volunteer. And then 5 years ago, I studied horticulture. And then last 2 years, I studied permaculture design here in the UK. When the artist described how the water and the river nurturing the trees, and the water will get a lot of mineral. I noticed that in the UK, so many backyard, the garden and Austria River also flowing. Is a good water and for plantation in different houses. And why I mention it, because the scientific research is in the institution, but it could be involving the people in different towns to test the water around us. And here, the Austria River will go to the wetland near the Exmouth. And it's maybe a certain spot will be continuing research, how powerful the water and the nutrition to nurturing the land. And because people planting the veggie here at home, and it's also good benefit for ourselves and for the garden, because people plant a lot of different species in the garden, and they can maybe share the information to your institute. Yeah, and it will be bring much more concern and participation, how we can build up the good ecology for the nature.
I don't have a mic.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think those comments are absolutely spot on. So there's increasingly an appreciation, and look, there always has been. We call what you're referring to as citizen scientists. So it's sort of, sometimes people think about universities as being the ivory tower. It's like this elite institution far away from people and where the action's happening. And of course, there's relatively few of us compared to the rest of the population. And so, because when you're working with something like ecology, there's Marc and I might have a couple of research sites ourselves that will focus on and study and see the species there. But of course, we want to basically be able to understand the whole world. That's effectively what we're trying to do collectively. But we can't do that if it's just ecologists who are based at research institution working on that. And so there is actively recruitment of citizen scientists to help us collect that data and report data. And there's all sorts of different ways to do this. So, for example, in the UK, there's been a scheme to sample river health, and it was basically the first scheme in the world. It's called RivPACs. That's the short name. Some of you might have been involved with it. Some of your children or grandchildren. Yeah.
I do river sampling for the West Country.
Oh, they do.
So once a month I go down to the river otter and take a sample, and then we just put it in an app and send it off every month. So.
Oh, okay. Is that just water quality that you do?
Yeah, we can do river. Some people do river fly and some people do chemical.
Okay. And there's another. So the EPT index. Do you use that?
So
that's macroinvertebrates as well. So yeah. So macroinvertebrates basically bugs. So we can take sweep nets in a river and look at the bugs, and there's 3 types of families of insects that are particularly good indicators. And so they begin with E and a P and a T, which is why it's called the EPT. And it was developed in the UK, and it's basically been sort of rolled out in many countries around the world, including Australia. We call the program OzRivers. And those 3 families of insects. So we look at water chemistry, or collectively, as all of us, we look at water chemistry, and we might look at water quality. Well, that's quality, and we might look at quantity. So you're looking at flow, but we also use these insects because they're really sensitive to pollution. And so if you have a good collection of those 3 types, you've got really good water quality. And if they start to drop off, it's a really fast, ready indicator. And so kids can be involved. We often do this kind of work at primary schools.
They're always looking for more people to adopt a little bit of river that they want to go.
Yeah, so it's really good. So those sorts of things are great. And the other thing, I'll stop now, but the other thing that we do is people record observations that they see. So for invasive species in the UK, for example, ladybird, the harlequin ladybird, that's an invasive species that's kind of been moving across the UK, and the hornet, the Asian hornet, I don't know if anyone's heard about that. So we're really reliant actually on citizens to alert us when these species come in. And so we use that in all sorts of different ways. And so you can upload your data, you say where you are, use your location, or it might be a plant you've observed, and that can be uploaded, and we continuously use that data. So one member of my team is basically relying on that data, which is being collected by, scientists and citizen scientists around the world.
I kind of want to share that I do feel really uncomfortable with the language that is kind of even holding like the basis of this discussion, and it seems to me that it's sort of based on quite a number of like fallacies that I think like sort of I'm really surprised that there's not more kind of nuance in there, because when you talk about when you talk about indigenous and non-indigenous, I mean that from the outset that presupposes some kind of static state of nature that we once existed in. But I mean that's as an ecologist you can't be operating surely from that paradigm. I mean the Earth is a system that's been evolving over 450 billion years, and like at what point was a particular species indigenous or not? When you're I mean the thing that the phenomenon that you're actually talking about is very specifically historically cited in the economy of empire, right? Like a lot of the plants that started to move around in the ways that they did, they weren't invaders that kind of moved into hostile territory. They were commodities that were moved around the world and sort of created a system that our consciousness, the consciousness that we're looking at these at this problem from has kind of been sort of has emerged, with that economy. So, like I kind of I don't know. I'm curious as to how much that kind of thinking actually feeds into the ecology, or do you do your science from the basis, the imaginary of a kind of fixed static point in nature? And it seems really important as well in terms of the scope of that work moving forward, right? Because we are now living in a period of escalating temperatures, right? So the climate is changing. And when you're talking about the invasion of species, you're really just talking about actually the natural movement of species with a changing climate. So if we operate from the basis that movement is invasion or hostile, in terms of other species, as with humans, it's quite perhaps that becomes an obstacle to actually addressing the issue that I thought, Léonie, you spoke about very eloquently, which is actually there is an ecological relationship that we don't have, and there's no going back, but there is an ecological relationship that we could, work towards, that actually works with that change, and kind of harnesses something in balance.
Can I speak to that just for a moment? That's really, really interesting. But thank you. And what comes up for me is this idea of barren. Like, I feel that river systems and even water and our soil and our gut are all incredibly barren at this point in time. And so it's almost like without the term invasive or non-invasive, there's a colonization. No, you can't use that word, can you? There is like a bloom of plants that can thrive in a much more barren landscape, and delicate ones can't. There's a brilliant work by Dr. Martin Bitodondo in Spain. In Europe's virgin forests, he's measuring the plant flora of the forest floors, and it's directly relating to the mycorrhizal, and it's directly relating to the quantity of nitrogen in the rain. So as rain more nitrogen on those soils through those trees into those very, very virgin forests, the nitrogen quantity dissolves the mycorrhizal, which doesn't enable those plants to grow. And so the flora gets lessons in richness. So I feel like there's this sort of, for me, as within, so without. So everything that's going on in our internal landscape is going on in what we see and live in. And you spoke very clearly to that earlier. And it just feels like that for me is the examination rather than the names. It's like, why is it, we can't live with these barren systems of our internal and our external, and we are on this brink of transforming it, because when you start working on your own biome, you cannot just sit and live in a biome that's broken and barren outside, and vice versa. When you start working on the biomes of your land and where you live, you will not be able to sit comfortably if you're not doing the internal. And maybe it's something like that. Maybe that's the wider discussion of it all.
Yeah,
I'd like to speak to that.
Yeah, I just want to second that idea. Sometimes I think we can get very distracted or stuck on a word, and it has to run. I really appreciate what you said there, and I think it's really important you've raised that. But I often notice as well in these discussions that the word is not allowing us to go into the behaviours, into the ways that we need, the behaviours that we need to change. That I just wanted to say that. Sometimes I get frustrated by getting stuck on the level of the word that's used to describe the same thing.
But I'm not talking about the word.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the image that it's actually conjuring, which is. I'm not talking about the words. I'm talking about the fallacy of an idea that there is some static state of nature that has been disturbed. Because actually what we need in order to actually move in a progressive direction, and the problem with that narrative is it does get weaponized by eco-fascists and by xenophobes, and because we've got scientists basically propagating the notion that there is some concept called nature. And actually, it's not the words, it's the actual it's the image that's driving it. Actually, if we understood that we inhabit a kind of dynamic, shifting, planet, and that is in a moment of crisis now, we might actually start culturally, linguistically, and in terms of our behaviour, actually start to move towards the patterns that actually point us forward, not backwards.
So I would, so I take your point, and I think it's a valid one. I would say no modern ecologist believes in a static nature. That's not part of our paradigm. We certainly study systems that are dynamic, that are changing. The idea of what we would call, in sort of mathematical terms, a deterministic equilibrium has been shown to be not the case for 40 years. And so when we start talking about this specific issue, I think we do need to split a couple things apart. So, for example, the main conservation agency that manages the city of Toronto is now planting trees 200 kilometers north of their historic range. And that's a good thing, right? That's anticipating those changes that are coming, and it's trying to, especially in a landscape that's fragmented by agriculture, assisting species to move to where they're climatically likely to be. And to me, that's a very appropriate way to manage a system. I think where the issue is that okay, so for example, I did an analysis of all the species that were introduced into the province of Ontario, and then asked which ones went on to become invasive. Invasive has a very specific meaning in ecology, which is those species that seem to be quickly reproducing, spreading beyond any sort of regular control that other species have, and they have negative economic and environmental impacts. So if we take those group of species that are defined that way, I then asked, of all the species that were introduced, which ones went on to become invasive? Was any of those introduced from elsewhere in North America? The answer was no. It was places that were far away geographically and that were climatically well matched. And so what it means is that we're taking species from their ecological context, which includes their pathogens, their herbivores, their predators, their mutualists, all these other interactions. We remove them from that context. We put them somewhere else, and they start causing local extinctions. Why? Is it because there's something better about them? No. Is there something about the world has now changed and they're just better suited to it? No, probably not. The reality is that we've given the local species that have pathogens, that have enemies, they're now at a disadvantage to a species that's been released from that. And so, I work with one species that's from Ukraine and Russia, which is in all of our minds for a lot of other reasons, but it's a vine that's actually quite rare in its native range. But in Toronto, it forms dense monocultures, and the meadow diversity goes from about 18 species per meter squared down to about 3 or 4. And when that decline happens, we lose pollinators, we lose habitat for birds, we lose another number of other things. So the question is not about a static environment, it's about we're causing a change. Those species are not in themselves doing something that is natural to them per se, it's that they're a manifestation of our actions. And the fact that we've permitted this to happen through our actions or our carelessness, we need to understand why some species do that and how we can ensure that they play by the same rules that other species do. And so it's not about, Jane and I would totally agree, and I don't want to put words in her mouth, but we wouldn't go and advocate getting rid of all species that weren't found there before 1500, for example. No one would, that's crazy. But we would certainly say we don't want to be introducing certain kinds of species unless we're sure that they can be regulated by the natural processes that are in place there. We don't want to cause further extinction by this movement of this species. And if we've moved a species that is causing, so when they start causing local extinctions, it's a matter of time until they cause total extinction, that we need to ensure that we're on top of that. So that's what it's really about. So it's not, I would say, it's not about a static view. It's really about the fact that they are a manifestation of our actions, just like pollution is, just like habitat destruction is, just like overhunting. This is one of those human-caused changes that we need to be aware of.
I'll just add to that because it felt like it was an important point for the room. So one of the challenges, I guess, of speaking across fields and across disciplines is sometimes what certain terms mean for someone like me as an ecologist, where I've got very strict definitions. It isn't necessarily intuitive to someone else, and everyone has different perspectives. My husband has a different perspective to me, and so as Marc indicated, so when we talk about non-Indigenous, non-native, whatever term you want to use for that, and I realise it's a really complex and really emotive, not necessarily emotive, I'm not getting the right word, but it's difficult to find a term for that. What we're meaning, as Marc indicated or hinted at, is when humans are moving species across their natural biogeographic ranges. So for certainly, as Marc said, every ecologist appreciates the dynamism. It's partly why we love working in these systems and why we're ecologists to begin with. But it's just the same way humans are the drivers of human-induced climate change. Humans are the drivers of human-induced species introductions. So it's the species that we're moving around. So 30% of the terrestrial landmass around the world is now pasture for livestock. And 90% of the species that we introduce have invasive characteristics. And most of them haven't evolved in that particular area, so they can't go unchecked, and then they spread, and then they cause negative impacts. And so that's the things that we're concerned about. And so with things like climate change, with any sort of environmental change, things have never been static. We've had ice ages in the past, and species will move themselves and they'll evolve, and that's what we want to encourage, and that's what we want to sort of enable to happen. So we wouldn't call those non-native, we wouldn't call those introduced, we wouldn't call those invasive. They are just range expanding, or they're range shifting. And so that many of the things we're trying to do is actually allow that to happen. But some of the challenges, if you're squeezed, if you're a plant or whatever you are, and you're squeezed by something, perhaps rhododendron, maybe you can't adapt. Maybe you lose so many of your individuals, you have no genetic diversity left, and your populations become really isolated, so you can't, mix between them, and so actually you can't evolve and you can't adapt, and then that species will die out. And so it's so I appreciate, and this is kind of why I raised it, and like I said, with working with Léonie, it's sort of one of the challenges with us. So when we think about invasion, and it's there's been this sub-discipline for 60 years, and so the meaning of language has changed over time. It's very much a process, and so sometimes I look for other terms to describe that, but we're very much thinking about this process. And I think the other important thing is to remember that we can't necessarily, and I don't want to open this big debate because it is quite a problematic one or a challenging one, or will take a long time, but terms and relationships we use for humans. Humans are one species. We are one species, but we're dealing with thousands. There's 2,000 invasive species in the UK. There's 35,000 in Australia. 35,000 invasive plants in Australia. So this is a lot. And so you've got to remember that how we think about with humans, one species, the terms we use to talk about ourselves is not the same when we're talking about, that many individual species.
Hello, my name's Rebecca, I'm a botanist ecologist, and I'm working with botanists. Some of them are quite purist and absolute about the native introduced thing, and they have a cut-off point if a plant was introduced before a certain time, and it's sort of okay if it's after it wasn't, all that kind of thing. And then you've got ecologists and rewilders being maybe a bit more relaxed about introduced plants and their benefits. I read George Monbiot saying that some of the plants seen as invasive can actually be beneficial to certain groups. So, for example, they're talking about Himalayan balsam, rhododendron. Their flowers, of course, are very beneficial to pollinators. And in the UK, with the UK being so nature depleted, most of the UK is just green concrete, and all our pollinating plants are important. Even the ones that are introduced, perhaps, are actually so important now because there's so little else left. And then you've got that debate of what do you want to protect more? Do you want to protect the pretty little native things that are being squeezed out by the Himalayan balsam and the rhododendron, or do you want to say, actually, no, we need anything that's flowering, anything, whether it's a garden plant, an introduced plant, native plant, anything is good because we're just so desperate for help for our pollinators. I'm just wondering what you think of that.
I can try.
I can also. Shall I have a go?
Sure.
I think immediately of a couple of things, but what in the riparian meadow and the different plant colonies we're putting together for our garden at Chelsea, we kept ourselves to native or naturalising through the RHS because we were being judged by the RHS, and we lots of different plant information sources tell you very different things, and we just took a line. But I mean, we planted Devil's Bit scabious in the garden to show how important that plant is for the food of the caterpillar stage of that insect. And I think it's important to move away from pollinating into what these biomes and colonies, when things start naturalising or renaturalising themselves in balance, it is that there are so many different functions of these plants, and a marsh fritillary butterfly will needs the leaves, not the flowers, specifically for the caterpillar to thrive. The caterpillar won't lay eggs on all Devil's Bit scabious, because it's going to depend on the temperatures that the soil are emitting onto the leaves themselves. So everything is a very delicate system and structure, and dynamic and miraculous. And so I think it was certainly for me the term plant spirit medicine keeps coming to me in these discussions of like whatever the plant, wherever it is, and whatever its function, when you have something growing in the land, it's in relationship with its soil, and there is an opportunity to get in relation to it and meet that plant. And away from the sort of scientific pieces of information about that plant, there is that also, hello, you're beautiful, maybe I can learn, maybe I can understand a bit more of you by this, in this relationship or way. And so, I don't know, I'm just throwing a few more things back at you just to enrichen the mosaic of what it is that we're looking at. And certainly when our landscapes are allowed to be active and dynamic again, the balance starts to coming in. And I think observation is really key of what's using what, who's using what. I don't know, does that answer some?
Yes, that makes sense to me. I mean, native plants, they've got a lot more associations with other, like the invertebrates and stuff that are very specific to them.
Yeah.
And so you could say that actually the native plants are going to be better for biodiversity as a whole.
There's a resonance.
The introduced ones. But yeah, so you've got to look at whether you're trying to kind of support bulk pollinators or whether you're actually going to be supporting biodiversity and specific insects that depend on certain native plants and things like that.
And there's an obsession with, pollinating flower meadows.
Yeah.
But if they don't have devil's bit scabious in it, the marsh fertility butterfly isn't going to be there.
No.
And it's very, very subtle nuances of what it is that we're creating.
Yeah. I was wondering if you had some. There's a lot of negative kind of about introduced species and things like that. But I was wondering to have that debate with the botanists who are maybe a bit more absolute about cut-off point, that they say that native is somehow better or something like that. To have that debate to say, have you got any examples of? I'm thinking of things like New Zealand pygmy weed, and like how damaging is it or not? It's tiny. It's it's pushing out other tiny things that grow in upland streams and things like that. But how damaging is it really? And can you think of any positive examples of introduced species that I could use in my kind of arguments against the absolutist native list people?
You want to go?
I can go. Okay. That's a great question, and I think that as ecologists, we often steer away from dichotomies because the world is grey, and certainly even some of the papers that Jane has written it really looks at what "it depends" means, right? And so you get these false dichotomies, and the answer is often "it depends." And so there are the purists out there, and I think for me, anytime that you're dealing with groups or interests that have very strong views, at the end of the day, it's evidence that should win. So, for example, certainly in North America, restoration. So when people undertake a restoration project, there's this school of thought which is you should be only using adapted genes from the local landscape, and what we're often seeing today is projects that will start to take populations from further south that are better adapted to climatic, or start taking a diversity of genes from different populations and bringing them in. Often we can see more success with those. And so that's a case, it's not the species level, it's below species level, it's the same type of thinking. When you're moving into species that have been imported from elsewhere, you need to be cautious, and you need to ensure that you have evidence that there isn't compounding negative effects of their presence. But as positive examples, it's the same thing that I talked about before, is that cities are now bringing in planting trees from several hundred kilometers further south. And the reason is that these trees are healthier, they're growing, less costs, but also they tend to be producing flowers earlier for pollinators that are now emerging earlier. And so there may be really good reasons to use species that are non-indigenous if they're filling some specific need. And I would say filling a need that for which there aren't good local native species that are already filling those needs. You wouldn't want to be purposely selecting species that you're uncertain about their other effects and interactions and co-evolved interactions and mutualisms for species that you have a safer bet that they probably do. But in those cases, there may be very valid reasons. Also, you think about cities and human-built landscapes, there might not be a natural analog to that new ecosystem, right? We might refer to them as novel ecosystems. And in those cases too, there may be reasons to use suites of species that may not have been found in the region historically. So green roofs, for example, will include species from the genus Sedum. And so we use them in Canada. They're obviously not from there, are usually around the Mediterranean. But there's very specific reasons to use them, even though I do think there's actually natives that we can use on those, and we have experiments. But there are reasons that you might want to use those species because it's an environment that doesn't have an analog. So there are reasons to move beyond that dichotomy, but you still have to be cautious. You still have to do due diligence. You still have to find evidence to support their use.
Something comes up as well about pollen quality and seed. I'd really love to have that discussion with you guys. Because you must look at pollen as well as seed, right? And there's something that really fascinates me about native pollen and that relationship with the minerals that are drawn up from the soil that feed that pollen, that then feed the insects of the regions within which they dwell and they come from, evolve. I don't know if you have anything on pollen.
No. Oh, this lady, yeah.
Hold on. Is it working? Yeah. I'm very nervous about asking a question because everyone's so academic here, and I'm completely changing the topic, I think, to a degree, but maybe not. So, you talked about in Canada there's a wilderness, and you've been very aware in the UK of the human footprint, even in areas that we would consider wild. Well, does losing our dark skies and humans bringing light with the cities impact on the flora a huge amount, and is something that's being significantly addressed at the moment? Because we talk about water courses, but what about the light pollution? That's something I'm really quite concerned about, because there's the mythology of the stars that's inspired humans from the start of time. And we know that we're losing the stars we can see. Is having a massive impact on humans who aren't necessarily noticing? But what about the plants? Is it really impacting on them as well?
I feel like I'm talking a lot. That's actually a wonderful question. And certainly when I take my children out on a camping trip out of Toronto, one of the first things they notice at night are the stars. And we start having conversations about the stars, and it's a conversation we wouldn't have in the city because we see 3 stars, right? But it is recognized that there is quite a bit of research on how light pollution is altering non-human species and ecological interactions. A lot of people focus on bats and nocturnal insects, but there is evidence as well that lights do alter the timing of events for plants. So it's a word called phenology, but when they decide to flower, and so in Toronto you can actually see it. A beautiful thing, I don't know if people here have ever been to Toronto or that part of Canada. In the autumn, the trees turn brilliant reds and oranges, and it's absolutely magnificent. In the city, you can see one side of the tree will be red a little too early, and the other side will be green. And then you look and you can see where the lights are coming from in the city. So there is evidence that light alters plants, how they're growing, when they're timing their events. But most people are really concerned about nocturnal insects, because most of us probably have seen these insects swarming around lights, right? They're congregating in these places. They often die because they're hitting a surface that's at high temperature, and so those have consequences. I don't know if you have further thoughts or anyone else?
Yeah, I do. It reminds me of in the room upstairs. There's a small little book by Ursula K. Le Guin called "The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction," I highly recommend reading this essay. We've put it on the Still Moving website for anyone who wants to find it online. But that essay ends with a line which is, "There are still seeds to be gathered and still room in the bag of stars." And I think, for me, absolutely, we cannot lose our stars. We cannot lose these orientations that go back to the beginning of our evolution, of how we navigate ourselves. And that's why we all have to, in our own ways, just find the ways forward. That essay is very beautiful in the context of a seed swap, because Ursula Le Guin, she's an incredible writer, and she doesn't feel human. She doesn't know how to relate to our evolution and the story of our evolution. So she goes back to the beginning, and she looks at the hunter and she looks at the gatherer. And she says that the story is what carries us. The way we tell the story of our evolution is how we perceive the world, or the story we tell ourselves is equally important, if not more important, than what we're doing, because it is the means by which we do. So she says that the hunter has dominated our story. But she says all the time there has been running the gatherer side by side with the hunter. And if we could begin to turn to the action of the gatherer, the person who goes out with the bag and collects seeds and brings them home, this is equally essential to our evolution and our survival. And I just wanted to share that with you, that this is a beautiful essay that I think you would love, and we can orientate ourselves. There is still room in that bag. Still we can find ways to keep those stars bright.
It's a really good point to think about the seed swap as well, which was Leonie's idea, and perhaps you could just give a little bit of context in what a seed swap is and what inspired you to suggest one.
So I think probably most people are aware that we're living in a time where the seed situation, the commercial seeds, it's a predatory situation. Over 60% of our seeds, possibly more now, because I was doing my research into this 3 to 4 years ago, is owned by just 4 companies in the world, and they are genetically modifying seeds, and it's creating food systems which are not nourishing to our health. So the very notion of collecting your own seeds in the land where you're from, learning how to do that, and I can recommend, if you want to learn how to do that, going to watch Vandana Shiva, I think she's called, an amazing woman from India who also lives in California. There are very simple videos online on YouTube where she teaches you why we should be collecting our own seeds and how to do it from your vegetables, and share them. And that sense, as I said at the beginning, of seeds being the original monies of the earth, the original economy. These are ways in which we can build communities together, that we can circumnavigate these incredibly predatory modern day forms of colonization, because that's what it is. The seed, the companies that are trying to control our food and take away our food sovereignty through controlling the seeds, they are one of the main predators in our modern day. So we can find ways around that by teaching each other how to collect seeds, how to promote local diversity, because if you collect seeds from your local land, you are contributing to the natural balance, Gaia-based diversities of that land, rather than bringing in seeds from goodness knows where, made in what lab, that can't even make seeds that you can use again. So it's so simple. And I think some of these solutions and how we put these stars into this bag are actually really simple. And we need to not get distracted by these bright lights of confusion and return to the ground and come back down to earth, to these simple things that have been happening from the beginning of our evolution.
Thank you. I think it's a really nice instruction for Catherine, actually. You can share just a few of the things that we do in East Devon with your community.
In East Devon, our street scene, who are our
look after our parks and gardens and all our nature and natural areas. They've been doing some great work. Now, as a council, we have a very, very tight line to navigate. So one person's wildflower is 3 people's weeds. And I'm sure you'll have seen the hoo-ha about, we don't call it rewilding, we call it nature recovery work. And we've taken a direction which is to leave certain areas unmowed. Now, where we do mow and where we don't mow creates an enormous amount of debate, concern, criticism, praise, depending on what side of the tidy nature. There are 2 types of people, tidy nature and leave it long and loose types of people. And so this is a really challenging issue for the council, but it's something that we are moving in the direction. We know how important it is. And the important thing is to bring people along with us. All through the work that I do, I have a firm belief that we need to do this with our community and not for them and not to them. So part of what I'm trying to do, now I am one person, I have climate change to deal with, and I'm one person, but I work through all the departments in our council. One of the things we're going to be doing in April and May is we're going to be running a campaign called Biodiversity Starts on Your Doorstep. As a UK, our gardens contain a larger area than all the national parks and all the protected areas combined. We have such an ability to start influencing local biodiversity, to get that connection back to our climate, our ecology, nature, biodiversity, all of this. I think so much of this has been lost, and we need to reconnect to it. And we can do that through our gardens. And so we're going to run this campaign in April and May, and it's going to have lots of lovely things that you can do, things you can do with your grandchildren, things you can do with your children. It's going to be informing you about the work that Street Scene are doing, and hopefully getting out to some of our tidy nature residents to help them understand what we're doing and why we're doing it in the way that we are. And also to discuss some of the bigger issues. So to start having a conversation about climate change, to start having a conversation about our ecological crisis that we're in, to start discussing why bees are important. Now, I imagine everyone here has a very good understanding of all these issues, but that's not the case with everyone. And so we want this to be a fun and an interesting way. And like you were saying, I actually think nature knows what nature needs to do. And I think too much of this, sometimes we try to contrive and manage certain situations. And one of the things we're looking to promote is No Mow May. And all you have to do to take part is not mow your lawn in May. Just lock up your lawnmower and the wildflower seeds are there. You know, you don't have to do anything. May is the bee hungry gap, and if you want to support and help bees, all you have to do is not mow for an entire month. And then your grass will be up here, and hopefully it'll be full of lovely colours and things like that. And we do it every year. And the first year I had to explain to all my neighbours that my lawnmower wasn't broken and I didn't need them to mow my lawn, and that's why I was doing it. And now, quite a few of my neighbours have all joined in, and they're taking part as well. And one of my biggest joys is standing in the morning, looking out my kitchen window and watching all the birds hop through the grass. And when it's really short, I don't see that, you know. And so I want to connect people back to nature, and just in that really small and local and, you know, in your patch. So keep your eyes peeled. We're going to be doing Biodiversity Starts on Your Doorstep. That's the name of our campaign, you know, and I want people to just start thinking about the little things that you can do, you know. Let's reduce our use of weed killers, let's provide water, let's plant natives, let's provide habitats for beetles, bugs and butterflies. Even if you've only got a tiny garden, let's all do something. Even if you've only got a doorstep, let's grow some wildflower seeds, or let's, you know, grow something. So we are here to help. And we do want to encourage you. And I'm so pleased to see so many people here. And I can't wait to go upstairs and see the sea spot. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And as Catherine says, we're going to the second part of our event today. So please do go upstairs, explore Léonie's amazing archive, and generously shared all her research with us. Swap some seeds, take some seeds. Even if you haven't brought your own, you can still take some seeds away with you. Léonie's generously donated a lot of seeds to the event tonight. And please do just enjoy the gallery after hours. Well, thank you so much for all of our speakers for coming and sharing their research with us and their passion.